Welcome to the X Podcast. It's so good to have you with us, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening on one of the podcast platforms. I got my friends here with me, Tim and Russ. How's it going?
The More Bros.
More Bros.
Is that More Bros.
Yep. It's good to have you back, Russ. You just went on a little
hiatus.
Yeah,
a
little trip. Went down to see some friends.
I did.
You want to tell us all about it?
Raleigh.
North
Carolina.
That's how I said it.
North Carolina.
It's good to have you
Does your
back.
accent pop back up the further south you go for a little bit?
Do I have an accent?
Yeah.
Is this?
I won't
Your face
think
is
you
getting
do.
red.
My face is getting red.
So that's good.
I want you to tell me about your accent.
I had a dream. It's weird. Russ was in my dreams last night.
That's weird.
So I thought
Nice.
you guys would know
Okay.
that.
Yep.
And
Scared.
You got off a plane and you were super distraught and
That happened
You looked
yesterday.
You looked horrendous when you walked off the plane.
Did that happen yesterday?
Well, tell me.
I don't
Do
know
I look
why.
horrendous
You
now?
look great, much better than mine. I don't know why that happened.
Well, I told you before this podcast, I had a dream about you the other night.
Yeah,
that
you did.
Grew your hair out,
Long.
dyed it blonde.
Yes.
But your face looked like a gremlin. It got old.
Why do I look like a gremlin?
And honestly, I woke up a little disturbed. So,
I would be disturbed.
We need to spend less
does
time
my
together.
face look red? Did I get a tan?
No, it just looks like you're embarrassed.
Am I embarrassed?
You just
Am I bashful?
You look like you've lost weight. You look swell.
I have lost.
You look really good.
6 pounds in the last 10
There we
days.
go.
Come
It's your
on.
keto secrets. I've been doing keto.
Yeah.
I'm excited about today's conversation. We have been in a little conversation at church that we're kind of extending onto the podcast for the sake of we think it's super interesting.
Yeah.
And it has huge implications on the way we live our life
Yeah.
and society and culture, even beyond church settings. So we've been having a conversation about our souls, and specifically, you're about to preach the second part of a 2-part series within an 8-part
It's a
series
2-part message within an 8-part series.
sermon.
Yes.
So if you're taking notes at
Yes,
home, we'll
it's-
try to keep track of that for me. But it's been awesome. The first week, you talked a lot about nature.
Yeah.
And the second week, you're going to talk a lot about nurture.
Family ghosts.
Family Ghosts. If you haven't watched it, you need to check your email and watch it. It's really incredible. But today, we were just thinking about how this seems to be true over the timeline of society, over the timeline of culture, is that any time a significant cultural event happens, you see the birth of something new in society. Maybe literally the birth of more babies, because everybody's been getting pregnant through quarantine. Me included. I'm
You're
not
pregnant?
I'm not pregnant.
Congratulations.
But my wife's pregnant.
Okay.
But hopefully not for much longer.
There is. I really think that COVID is going to be when we talk about this, it's going to be the latest
It's going to
one.
be the next baby boom.
The next baby boom.
People have
and
nothing else to do.
The next generational boom.
But with every culturally significant event, there seems to be the birth of an entirely new generation.
A new label.
A new label
Right.
for a group of people born at a certain time.
Yeah.
And so, tailing off of that, I think it's important to understand how much of our interactions with the people around us have to do with which generation they were born in.
Yeah.
Right now,
Yeah.
as compared to any time in history, there's more living generations than ever before.
You know why that is?
The lifespan.
Lifespan.
Right?
So early 1900s, the average lifespan for a male was like 46 years old. So today, the average lifespan is now reaching in the 70s and 80s.
Yes, but this is actually the first
And dropped
year.
a year during COVID.
It
This
did
is
drop
the
a year.
first year that
I
the
know,
average
but
lifespan's gone up.
that's part of why. So
Yeah.
now we're living way longer than ever.
But there's a lot of implications.
No need for retirement
Or
when
there's
you
a
only live to
lot of
46.
repercussions to that. You think in your workplace, you're
Yeah.
probably working
Oh,
with
yeah.
anywhere
Multiple.
from 4 to 5 generations in your workspace. In your neighborhood, you're probably living anywhere with 4 to 5 generations. You think about our politics in this country,
Yeah.
that we're trying to, all of our politicians are trying to cater to demographics that are from 5 or 6 generations. It's hugely complicated.
Yeah.
We're dealing with social issues, racial injustice, all sorts of new issues that have come to the table over the last 20 years. They're not new issues, but they're more prevalent and have been more talked about. Things like climate change, things like women's rights, not generally women's rights, but women in the workplace, they equal pay, things like that. Things like gay marriage, things like transgender issues that are coming to light. There's a whole bunch of social things that we're talking about in a context where people come from all sorts of different generations.
Yeah.
And so we see that as this potentially huge hurdle and potentially really cool opportunity for us to make an impact in society. So what generation are you?
I am
Can you just tell
Gen
everybody
X.
your age, please?
Yes, I'm Generation X. So that's mine. What's yours?
Millennial.
You're a millennial, and you're a baby millennial.
We're
I am.
on opposite ends of the
Ends of-
millennial
yeah.
spectrum.
What year were you born?
84.
84.
Yeah.
You're right there in the middle of millennial.
Am I?
Yeah, it started in 1980. So I was born in 95, and I think it's important to acknowledge too that every generation, depending on what website you look at or what
Yeah.
book you
Right.
read,
Have different labels.
will have different start
And I think it's
timestamps.
and I think it's also important that as we talk about generations to say that they're not a box for which people are. I think there's behaviors, there's cultural behaviors that go with a generation that grows up in a similar era. So culture impacts your generation significantly, and so I think it's important to not say, hey, this is a box, and everybody who is a millennial is like this, or
Right.
everybody who's a Gen X
Just like a
is
personality
this.
type. It
Yeah,
just gives
it gives you clues. Generational clues to like what life was like for that person and kind of why their mindset could be different. Just think about the mindset of somebody who is a traditionalist or someone who is a pre-World War II mindset today living versus my daughter.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like their world is different.
Right.
Like I was just thinking about how the younger generation, you got the youngest generation right now, Gen Z, they usually call. I know there's a new one that's emerging right now. I think COVID's going to be that cultural shift that's going to, I do. But I think you look at that, and I'm not sure, even within that generation, there's still quite a significant technological jump. But like I think about my daughter, and maybe a little bit younger, and your kids for sure will be like this. It's like they don't know any different than this device is used to talk and look at people.
Yeah, when you say this device,
I'm
for
talking
our
about a phone.
listeners,
Yeah, sorry. So cell phone. And so the difference being that this means something different to the young generation. Whenever they look at this, they're not going to think I listen and I talk to somebody. They're going to think I look at somebody and talk to them.
Yeah.
And it's like you'll find people in much older generations that this is a telephone.
Yeah.
Where's the rotary dial on my telephone? You know
Well,
what I
it's
mean?
funny,
Like,
you know.
and so it's just going to be so different. They will not think of this as get on the phone and talk. Like my daughter, she doesn't. My youngest doesn't even like to do that.
Yeah.
They use it's FaceTime. It's not every time.
I think it's important to acknowledge just how much change has occurred in the last
Oh, my.
25 or so years. I know it's happened
That's-
throughout history, but
Not
it just
to the
seems
speed.
like the
Not to
exponential
the speed
nature
it has,
of
yeah.
change has been incredible. I can remember going to antique shops with my grandmother, and I'm like,
they have
what's
flip
this?
phones in there?
Well, it's like, what's this? And it's a rotary phone, And
My
I
grandmother
didn't
used
know.
to have a rotary phone.
Yeah, I didn't know how to use it.
It's so annoying dialing from a rotary phone, by the way, especially if it's like a 1-800 number and you mess up halfway through.
Well, my point is that
You have never done one.
I
have
saw
you?
somebody on social media just
long
recently.
time ago.
Okay.
I saw somebody on social media just recently ask their young kid to take a picture.
Right.
And it's the first generation that takes their pictures like
Yeah.
you take it on an iPhone, then taking it on like a Kodak,
Yeah.
whatever. Or,
What's
What's that? You don't even know what it's called. What's that thing? It's got a little button
Disposable
on the
camera.
top. That
Disposable camera.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know why. I
Well,
immediately think of that
or-
episode in New Girl at the end where they see a phone that actually is connected to a cord.
I'm unfamiliar. What's New Girl?
New
Yeah,
Girl?
I
Oh
think
my
that
gosh.
was probably not my generation.
Oh my gosh.
that's-
Never mind.
Wow, you're old.
Do you guys know what The Office and Friends are? I'm
heard of it.
old.
Never
okay.
heard of it. Do you know what?
Schmidt.
Hey, you want to
and
go
say,
old?
why
You
is
know
there a
what-
rope attached to this phone?
You know what? If you want to go older, do you ever heard of a show called Seinfeld?
Yes.
So I didn't know-
sucks. I hate
guys.
Seinfeld.
I remember when Seinfeld went off
Seinfeld
air.
is the horrible version of Friends.
You were a baby when Seinfeld
yeah.
went off
I
air.
don't
I
know.
think.
Yeah.
Right?
Don't ever watch it.
On VHS or whatever.
Seinfeld. It's not that awful.
I don't like it.
All right,
Yeah,
so
still
Russ,
kind
why
of
don't you share with us your experience on all of the generations you interact with?
Oh man.
Oh my gosh, that's kind of a
just
loaded
saying.
question.
Just kidding.
Why don't we
Yeah.
just go through
Well,
each
what do they say?
generation
Okay,
define it first?
so you mentioned 6 generations.
'Cause I think it's-
and so as a template, they say most working environments have up to 4.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal. That's a lot of different mindsets. That's a lot of different
Most
templates
of your baby boomers
for
are all
people to work
retiring
from.
right now. They're on that. They're in that retirement zone.
Yeah.
My father-in-law, he just retired last year, right? Yeah, last year, and so he would be in that category.
Of baby boomer. Yeah.
Baby
Do you want to
boomers.
define what the different ones are?
Well, we talked about them.
Let's go through. I think it's important. I liked where you're about to go with workplace stuff, and just how important it is that we recognize that we're all coming from a different place and a different set of nurture and a different context.
I also think that why we even have this conversation. I just think that every single one of us, in the series, we're talking a lot about EQ, right? And I think that this generational conversation that we're talking about is all EQ.
Yeah.
How important is it? Is you go, wow, who cares? Or maybe you just think this is fun facts or whatever. It's not. We are working next to people in older generations and younger generations, and they're going to have behaviors.
Yeah.
They're going to have mindsets and things that are different. And I think that it's really important for us to learn, educate ourselves.
Yeah.
And when you're aware of it, then you can start treating people well.
Yeah.
Because you understand where they come from instead of writing people, they're just
Well,
old, they don't know. No,
should
they
help
haven't.
you grow in
They grew
compassion.
up in a different environment and there were different pressures, and so that's why they feel differently.
And
about
just
it.
like any other level of diversity, whether it's
Yep.
ethnic diversity,
Gender diversity.
anything else, the more that you have it integrated into your life, not only can you understand each other better for compassion's sake, but you can complement each other better to build something
Build
greater.
better.
So a small example, this
agree.
past weekend when I was in Raleigh, I was having breakfast with my former pastor. And when we talk about generations, I think there's the natural generation gaps in any era of older and younger. Then there's the specific eras that we're talking about in history that define. And I think both of those can kind of filter into each other.
Yeah.
So more on the former, I was having breakfast with my former pastor, and they're in the middle of changing culture at their church. And so they got just like any church, but probably more than most. They have some older people, then they have a lot of younger people. And there's some people on the team that are just chopping at the bit. He was just telling me, he said, it's funny, son, because like there are people that are like, would you slow down? You are changing things way too fast.
Yeah.
And then he's got some younger people on the team that's like, what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
Like, who cares? Let's do this. We need to turn the corner. And he's like, look, if you turn a large ship that quick, people are going to fall over. And he made it, it sounds so simple, but he said something I thought was really profound, the distinction. He said, a lot of people think that older people have more insights. He said, but I actually think a lot of times it's the young, sharp people that have more insights, but older people tend to have more maturity. And he said, the balance is what I'm trying to do, he said, is I'm trying to combine and marry the insights and energy and youth of some of the leaders around the table with the maturity of timing and wisdom of pace from the older.
Yeah.
And so I just think, I say all that to say is that whatever we're talking about when it comes to generations, like I think the end goal is when they can learn from each other,
Yep.
Yeah.
everyone wins.
Yeah. I agree.
Yep, I think that it's important to first, I think, lay out the different generations, a couple things that maybe
Unique.
Are unique, a couple markers that would help you identify each one. And I think we should start maybe with the generations hanging on by a thread. I hate to say it that way.
That sounds awful.
Oh, man.
I'm so sorry
Wow.
if you are this. But this one is called the GI generation is one term. I think another maybe more familiar term is the greatest generation. And these people were born from 1901 to 1926. They're children of World War I generation.
Is that why they're called the GI
And
generation?
they're fighters in
Yep.
World War II
That's
generation. They were young during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And so obviously that had a huge implication generally on the way that they grew up and what it was that was important to them. They're excellent team players, community-minded, strongly interested in personal morality and near absolute standards of right and wrong, strong sense of civic duty, strong loyalty to jobs, groups, schools, that they didn't retire at all. They worked until they died, and They were very frugal, used everything they had. That's the greatest generation. And so I was just interested if you guys had people in your circles then,
Say what?
and in your
My circles
family.
that were from that generation?
Yeah.
My grandfather was, but I mean,
You remember any of it?
do I remember what?
You remember the way he was?
Oh yeah, quite a bit.
What was it about?
He lived to be 91, and then my grandmother lived to be 97 on my mom's side.
Yeah.
So I knew them pretty well, and so they would have been born. Oh gosh, so when did he die? So wow, they would have been born probably in that 1910s,
Yeah.
1910s decade would be my guess. So they were fascinating, the way they lived. But it was hard though because they lived so long. So much changed with them and with life and stuff. So it's an interesting. You got to think about that's the generation that was just starting to parent in the Great Depression.
How about this? They said most of them grew up without modern conveniences like
Oh, yeah.
refrigerators,
Yep.
electricity, or air conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These people were
or
tough,
like
man.
my grandfather,
They're tough.
How
his
far
wife,
everything
my
was
grandmother, and I think this was part of that generation. She never bothered to learn how to drive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My dad's mom, same thing. She never learned how to drive.
Yeah.
All right, on to the next
Interesting.
one. 1928 to 1945, the silent generation or the mature
Traditionalists.
generation, the traditionalists, they went through the formative years of their life in an era of suffocating conformity, but also post-war happiness. This is a generation that fought the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The first drumbeats of civil rights started in this generation. They're the richest, most free-spending retirees in history. These people had strong views about marriage. Having children.
No one got divorced.
Yeah, no one got divorced. Having children out of wedlock was not
That was frowned upon.
accepted. Retirement to them is sitting in a rocking chair in the final days and experiencing just the peace at the end of life. I don't know. This is some of my
Your
grandparents.
dad, your parents
So-
were born in that or no?
So my dad was born in 44,
Okay.
mom in 46. And
Tail end.
it is interesting when I think about my dad, it is the silent traditional type. And I don't even know if that's what they mean by silent, but very much, yes, get to the end, work hard,
Yep.
be a really good person, traditional values. Of course, they're from
Yep.
Southeast. I know there's so much, again, like we talked about, this is just a basic template. So much can factor in.
Yeah.
But, your typical middle class, hardworking, saved up for retirement. Wouldn't call either of them free spending, other than I get my wanderlust from my dad. He loves to travel. But besides that, one of the actual generational differences I noticed that me and him talk about and have friction on at times is I am more of a spender. I am more of
Yeah.
a free spender, whereas he came up out of, his dad fought in World War II.
Yeah.
And remembers the Depression and is way more conservative with money.
I thought
way
just
more
it's
economic.
funny to me that they have that label on there. I think almost everybody you meet that's going to be from that demographic, that age down, I think they're all going to be very frugal. You had to be frugal growing up in that environment. And imagine you were kids. I mean, the Great Depression, late 20s, 30s.
Yeah.
You were kids growing up in that, so that's all you saw was that everything was penny pinching and you know what I mean. That's all you witnessed growing up. So that's what you pattern your life after.
A couple other markers from this generation. This is pre-feminism. Excuse me.
yeah.
Women stayed home generally to raise children, and if they worked, it was only certain jobs like teacher, nurse, or secretary.
That's part of that traditionalist mindset.
Well, it's funny
Very
because
traditional.
my
Yeah.
buddy and I were talking about this because he remembers when he was growing up, and he's only 25, 25. But when he was growing up in Georgia and in North Carolina, he said it was weird if the mom went to work. But my parents are older, and they always both worked. My mom was an elementary school teacher for 30 years. My dad, high school and athletics coach, and so I don't know. Maybe,
Interesting.
I don't know if they bucked the tradition or if it
Well,
was
it
their
just
circle.
says that if they did work, that they were teachers,
Yeah.
secretaries, or nurses.
Yeah. They
And-
fit into
That mold.
categories
Yeah.
and role definitions. Like,
Yeah.
okay, if you're a woman, you do this. You
Yeah.
don't
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the traditional roles that generation just kind of
I think
lived
here's
in.
another interesting fun fact about this generation is that they're avid readers.
Yeah.
especially newspapers.
Well, you know why that is.
My dad.
You know, there wasn't
They didn't
much
have
else to
TV.
do. But
They
anybody
didn't
that
have
I know,
TV
my
growing
family
up.
from that generation, they loved to read. It's
They didn't have
interesting.
TVs. That was their form of.
All right, moving on, getting more and more
Yeah.
recent. We got the baby boomers.
Yeah.
These, let's see, the baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. It says they have two subsets. The first one, they're Save the World revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s. That's the first subset. Second subset, the party harder career climbers, or in parentheses, the yuppies of the 70s and 80s, also called the me generation, the rock and roll generation, ushered in the free love and societal nonviolent protests, which triggered violence. They're self-righteous, self-centered, just a generalization, chill out. They buy things now. They are the first to use a credit. Really busy. What are some other things? The first TV generation began accepting homosexuality. They're generally optimistic, driven, team-oriented.
Well, I think when you think about that generation, you have to really, again, remember what you said early on, is that there's some kind of significant event that kind of launches all of these, right? So when you went from the GI generation to the one after that, it was World War II. When you look at that generation, when it ended and this one starts, World War I. This one, World War II. So this generation grew up post World War II. So that's where the economy in the U.S. was booming. And for the first time ever, people are starting to have money. They're starting to have expendable, income, and like they're able to do stuff. So some of those things are what led to a baby boom, is because instead of having families that are growing up with not having barely any money and any food to survive, they now are flourishing. So they started having a lot of kids.
Well, I think what's
is what they
interesting,
did.
too, is that this is the first generation where mothers worked outside of the home in record numbers.
Yeah.
Where most households were two income instead of one income.
Yeah.
Which I think has a huge... Also, first divorce generation,
Yeah.
where divorce is beginning to be accepted as a tolerable reality.
It was.
Very interesting.
And first was the one we were talking about, first retirement.
Yeah, this is the first group because they actually started making money and the economy's booming, where they were the first one that really started thinking about retirement.
Well,
that wasn't even
I
a
think
thought.
it's the
before.
first one, the first generation that started thinking about retirement as a means of being able to enjoy their life
Yeah.
after their kids left
Yeah.
home. Instead of, like the previous generation, sitting in a rocking chair, they go skydiving, exercise,
Yeah,
take up
they want to
hobbies.
do stuff like
Go get a yacht in
like
Florida.
my wife's parents. Like I was just saying, like my father-in-law, he just retired a year ago, and where are they right now? Well, they're in Florida, on their boat.
That's where
They go down and they live on their boat, and they've been there for the last 2 months. So it's and so they would have been born in that generation. My parents were born just very, like 48 and 49, so they would have been born just into that generation as well. And yeah, for sure.
Yes, that's baby boomers, the largest generation in history, too. Next one.
I thought the
we're
millennial
getting-
generation actually had
I
surpassed.
know, I haven't got there
Oh,
yet.
okay, sorry. Well, you said in
Man,
history.
we are getting really personal now. Generation X. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. I thought this was super interesting that they were sometimes referred to as latchkey kids. Mm-hmm. You know why?
Yeah, because their parents weren't there.
Yeah.
They both worked.
So they came home and,
and
often had a key to get in the house because
Yeah.
no one was home.
Yeah.
Very entrepreneurial, very individualistic. Government, big business means little to them. They feel misunderstood by
Speak to those
generations.
things. They watched their parents revolt against the government. So they grew up with a massive distrust for any kind of government, large, big business, any of that kind of stuff.
cynical of major institutions,
Yep.
which they feel like failed their parents or them, or caused them to not be there for their children. They desire a chance to learn, make a contribution, tend to commit to themselves rather than an organization or a specific career. This is interesting. This generation averages 7 career changes in their lifetime. It was not normal to work for a company for life, unlike previous generations.
If they're 7, then I promise you, millennial are going to be. It's going to be 12 to 15, because they were a little bit more loyal than like millennials are when it comes to workplace employment.
Late to marry. They were the first generation to marry
Why do you think that is?
after cohabitation.
Why do you think that is?
Late to marry, quick to divorce. I don't know.
I'll tell you why.
This was like
You just said it.
decades before I was around.
No.
Start looking at
If you understand them, it makes a ton of sense. Why? Because this is also the first generation. Gen X was the first generation to really grow up in broken homes or divorced homes.
Yep.
So when you grow up in a divorced home, a large percentage, then they're going to be slow to get married. Why? Because their parents got married at a young age. That's what you did. The baby boomers all got married in your teens and younger, and they watched their parents get divorced. So they're like, I'm not going to do that. So they got married way later than ever before. They were putting it off to even, like you said, cohabitate and really make sure, because they've seen, they're actually the first generation to feel the effects of divorce.
Yes.
And so that's why it began to shift the way they are when it comes to relationships and getting married and how they are.
Well, it's
in general.
probably that plus when you have a revolution of morality shift
Yeah.
and sexuality
That-
shift
in the 70s.
then you also desensitize.
Desensitize.
Not desensitize, but
Not
that too,
desensitize.
but decentivize
Demoralize.
the reason for marriage.
Just kidding.
One of the reasons for marriage.
They view themselves as survivors from their childhoods. They're generally short on loyalty and wary of commitment. And I think this is interesting that a lot of their issues when they were in school, whereas the generation before them, the misbehavior was we pass notes and we chewed gum during class. The Gen Xers, their issues in school were more around drugs and alcohol, which I think is interesting.
It is. And they're the market leaders right now.
Yes.
So if you want to know who your market leaders are in business, it's Gen X.
Yes.
Your baby boomers are about on the way out and retiring, and your Gen X are the ones that are actually running most of your organizations.
You're my market leader.
I'm your market leader. So, and I'm on the later end of it.
Yeah.
So you got to imagine that that's who you have right now that are running most corporations.
I want to take a quick pause right here, and I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question, but how do you think being from Gen X has affected you pastoring a church?
I've thought about it.
Really?
This is, yeah. I actually read a book that I thought was a fascinating book on different generations when it comes to faith and Christianity. Was a book called Generational IQ by, I think his name is Hayden Shaw. And that book was really actually helpful for me in understanding ministry. So what's fascinating is that if you follow, so you have generational differences, and we talk about all these cultural things here. There's also similar trends if you follow church life. So what really came out of my generation is what you saw in the 90s, right? Because they were the ones that were becoming church leaders in the 90s, starting in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. That was where you saw the rise of mega churches. That's where you saw an emphasis on the type of experience. That's where you go back church history. They would say seeker-sensitive churches started to come from.
Started branding churches.
Yeah, and so I feel like that type of church, like, so what they did was they shifted away from traditional. Like there was a real shift in the 80s into the 90s in church life that moved away from the hymns, that moved away from traditional type of church life and experience to something at that time that would be a more modern vernacular in church history. When you talk about the music and the style and the way it would reach casual, that started, like the idea of people dressing casual was, we're talking, that's in the 90s, late 80s, 90s. So my generation will be the ones that were actually becoming pastors then.
Yeah.
that
So
started
how has
leading
it
churches.
affected you, though, in the way that you lead George? Because honestly, this church is pretty different than a traditional expression of what church has been in the past. So
But I think that's part of it. Part of me was I was rejecting that.
you're revolting.
I revolted against that.
Yeah.
What I saw and grew up, not just what I grew up, because I grew up a little bit and it wasn't super traditional what I grew up in, but I saw the ineffective nature of church like that. And so there was a level of me that was, you can go back to some of the stuff that we used to do. I feel like we used to push the boundaries a lot more than we do now. We talked about that just last week about some of the series stuff we used to do. It's kind of like
you should Google it, everybody.
I wouldn't do it now. There were things that we did that I feel like were kind of edgy, and I wanted. Where does that attitude come from?
I love the series you did called the F word.
No, we're not talking about that.
We were talking the other day. He goes, "Yeah, a lot of people left after that."
and so. I think some of that comes from that nature of...
That's the one where you just started yelling the word at the beginning of every sermon.
Yeah.
The F word?
No.
If this makes you uncomfortable, you need to go, bleep. I'm just kidding. Okay.
You need to lead fast. So it was just... I think that has influenced, though. I think it has influenced a little bit of what I would prefer in church. Now, where I see that being different and what kind of was a little bit of a, for a while, this was a conversation, I would say, over the last 10 years of, hey, millennials, and I know we're jumping that, but when it comes to church, there was this idea that millennials are a little bit kind of, I'm going to say resistant, but they're intimidated to the point of, is big church, it's not authentic, that it's like we're into authentic, not into big show. Mm-hmm. We're into this. And so what you have and you're watching is you're looking at different generations and their preferences for church style. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm talking about, right? And what happens is that the preference style that wins has everything to do with either who that leader is, what generation they're from and what they feel like they're, or which generation's paying for it.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So the generation, so that was one of the things that was a challenge for me, is that we were actually going into this, and I was younger still then, to start a church and wanting to kind of do things differently, knowing that it in many ways it feels like it would alienate an older generation. Well, here's the hard part. The older generation of that, they're the ones that would pay for it.
Did you really see that, though?
Yeah.
Because what I noticed...
I didn't see it come to light. That was a fear. That was a concern.
Right.
But what we ended up seeing was that
the
as
opposite.
you reach younger people, that their grandparents were coming and their parents were coming because their kids were there, and they're like, I'll go and I'll fund this any day of the week.
And they love it because they're seeing,
and they do, because the life is happening. And so but we had several people that did not like it because they preferred something more traditional.
Sure.
And so I think some of that stuff did play into kind of the church that we are today.
From your perspective, do you think it has any implications on the way our church looks?
Ooh. Well, I think part of it too is whether you're in an urban area, suburban area, or rural area. Mm-hmm. Because if you are only doing youthful, edgy, whatever type of church that mostly only younger people would like in the city, you better be coming from a good backing. Mm-hmm. So I think it helps when you're in a suburban area like we are now, and you're reaching all kind of people. And so you are reaching younger people, but you're also reaching people. And as church trends grow, that makes it easier.
Yeah.
And so you have families, and you have some families that might come here and be like, I don't really care about all the lights, but my teenager's life's being changed forever, and my kids are falling in love with it.
Yep.
And so I don't know, like from what other perspective?
No, I don't know. I think that if I had to name a few, I'd say that your generation is heavy presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And very...
So one specific thing that I think's changed, and maybe this is what you were getting at, is I think this is the younger side of the millennial generation, but even going into Gen Z, is not only the preference and the style is changing to more of an authenticity, but I think even definitions are changing. So like excellence 10 years ago might have been super polished. Let's try to look like a concert. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of younger people now that are coming in saying, hey, I can go to a concert, and no matter how much money you spend, the concert's still going to look better than that. I actually care about authentic community and an experience that feels real. Mm-hmm. So I think even the definitions of excellence are changing based on the values that the upcoming generation places.
I just think it took a lot more effort even in as recent as, 20 years ago to do something really excellent. Like technology was in a different place.
Right.
In order to do any sort of video, any sort of TV
media,
programming,
visuals.
there was a lot more that went into it.
Right.
And so you did have to have your approach together more together than you do now. Whereas we can film church-wide videos on our phone in 30 seconds and get them out. And most people don't really notice quality difference.
Well,
Right.
and I think that quality's already become acceptable, where you have, I think, a big shift in that with that what you're saying, late millennial, Gen Z. I would say really even the Gen Z is that they have grown up with YouTube, not TV. So the people they idolize, like my kids in that kind of age,
Yeah.
and you say, is they idolize YouTubers,
Well,
which
let's
are
get
usually
there.
low production
Yeah.
quality. Right, they're low production quality, but they're personable. It's just them in front of a phone. And, hey, it's my cooking show, and they watch. Or here's how I do makeup, and that is what appeals to them. Is I feel connected to that person.
But speaking on that, I think here's another interesting thing about the Gen X group is that you guys all, I think, had some conformity in what you watched.
Yes,
You know, so like,
absolutely.
we all watched
National
the-
TV, whatever's
we all
on 4,
watched
6, 10, 28.
the,
That's what
you
channels
know,
are here.
USA versus Soviet Union
Yep.
hockey game. We
Yep.
all knew when that was on, and we all watched it when it played. The next
Yep.
day or the next morning or whenever that happened. We all read this paper, or everybody
Yeah.
had their news source. We
Newspaper.
all watched. This is good. Walter Cronkite. Is
Walter
that-
Cronkite would have
And
been.
so
I mean,
you-
I was. He
we
was old
we
when I
all
was young, but
watched
yeah.
these people, and you guys had that unity as far as where you received your information
Yeah,
from.
I agree.
And so I
Now.
think that I don't know how that defines your generation, but I think it absolutely does.
Well, there's less polarization and division.
Yeah. Well, I think it affects the way that you guys, again, total overgeneralization, because that's what we're doing today, I think it affects the way you guys view people who get their information from a different source.
Sure.
Because I think
Well, what's credible?
Right.
It's what you view as credible,
Right.
and what they view as credible could be like, oh no, I've watched all of her YouTube videos. Like she's really good, and it's like, why does that mean she knows anything about economics?
your generation, I think, has had to learn, and I think everybody's on a different journey, how to have conversations, meaningful conversations with people who get their information from different
Yeah.
places,
Right.
I agree.
instead of just missing each other.
Yeah.
I do
We watch
think
the same
we
thing.
should finish the generations, but I do think I'd love to circle back. Even when we do later to what we view, what we forecast, what we see for church life.
Yeah.
Because that's our world. It may
And I
not be
think-
someone else's world, but I do think it's a significant conversation.
Let's do it.
And I just there's more things that come to my mind just even as we talk about it that I've been in church circles with leaders for the last 10 years that these things have been topics of conversation quite a bit.
Well, what's beautiful about even church settings is that they are a picture, a representation
of our
of what's
communities.
happening in business,
Yeah.
what's happening in communities, and what's
Yeah.
happening in the world. 'Cause
It's a social experiment.
in what
right?
other place do you have every generation coming together? Where
Right.
we've got the generation that hasn't even been named yet. We've got
Yeah.
the
I'm telling you, the
oldest living
name's going to be
generations
attached to
that are
COVID.
here.
The name's going to be attached to COVID.
I don't know, but let's
I
talk
really
about the
think it
next
is.
generation, which could, if you're going to ask us at this table, probably the best generation. It's the millennials, Generation Y, born from 1981. This website says 2000. Some websites go to 95, 96, 97.
Yeah.
AKA they're the 9/11 generation, the people that remember where they were when 9/11 happened. They are nurtured by omnipresent parents that are there all the time.
Helicopter parents?
Yes, helicopter parents. They've learned to respect authority again. Crime rates fell with this generation.
Hey, speaking of which, though,
Yeah.
I something I was thinking about. We had a conversation about generations before in previous podcasts, and as I was kind of processing through and reading about it, I never really put this together. But because of the way we grow up and the length of generations, and it does change. But for example, my kids are not millennials;
Right.
they're Gen Zs.
Mm-hmm.
So the parents that we're talking of, millennials, are baby boomers.
Well,
For the most
millennials,
part.
I think, generally are older than people think.
That's
that
what I
they are.
mean.
Yeah.
What I'm
Yeah.
saying is that it
Under-
almost skips a generation, even though we don't think that way.
Right.
And I think of my kids. Well, I'm Gen X. I think my kids, but they're not millennials.
And I think generations are passing quicker and quicker with the
they
advancement
are.
of
They are.
technology.
They're
So-
they're shortening the length of
Yeah.
generations.
And
It's
so
changed.
that matters. But here's some other things: falling crime rates. They feel enormous academic pressure. This is the first generation that had to consider that they might be shot when they're at school,
Yeah.
which I think is hugely important as far as development. They have great expectations for themselves. They prefer to work in teams. They envision the world as a 24/7 place. They want fast and immediate processing. How about this? They've been told over and over again that they're special and they expect the world to treat them that way. They do not live to work. They prefer a more relaxed environment with a lot of hand-holding and accolades. So, Mr. Millennial, why don't you riff on your experience?
Fellow millennial, I would love to. I
identify as a Gen Z.
There are some great videos that I've seen on millennials. I'm sure you guys have too. They're pretty good.
But they're all like making millennials look like teenagers.
Oh, I know. They're not.
Which
I know, but
it's
but-
like,
well,
no,
that's
they're
why I
40,
say
dude.
They're 10 years old, but yes.
That's why it's a great observation you made that there's a significant gap in the beginning of millennials and the end of millennials. But overall, you know, when you frame millennials, they're a group that value independence, value mobility. They grew up in the participation trophy era. So on the dark side, they can fall into entitlement and softness and some of them laziness. But they're the group. We've been talking about the Andy Stanley podcast on generational diversity in the workplace. And whereas was it baby boomers and baby builders, that whole era wanted to be told, okay, tell me your story and just tell me as it is. And then Gen X was keep it authentic. They say in the workplace, millennials, it's keep it interactive. So millennials get bored really easy. And millennials, they want a place where the main thing that they crave overall is that they are making a contribution. They say that sometimes that CEOs and bosses get really annoyed at the thought of, I just want to make a difference. But that really is, for most millennials, the cry of, I want to contribute.
And I want to
change
make
the
money,
world.
though.
And
I want to make both.
And I want to make money. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, millennials also are starting to marry older and older and are more mobile in where they move to work.
Yeah, all those things.
Yep.
I think they're
for
the
sure.
Starbucks generation.
When did you get your first cell phone?
12th grade, senior year of high school.
I think I was 21.
And this is when you had to ABC. This is you had to.
There's a term for that. I can't remember what it is.
Click to text.
No, it's
Click to
but
text.
there's a term for it. I can't
pretty
remember the
sure
name
that's
of
what it is.
I thought it was something
Yeah.
else. Where you have to hit the number 3 times to get
Yeah.
In
C.
7th grade English, that's where I was when 9/11.
I was
Second
I was
period,
at work on the
7th grade
38th
English.
floor of Rhodes Tower.
And you got down.
We got out. We were all
weird.
looking. We were like, "What's going on? America's
That's
under
horrible.
attack. We're getting out of one of the tallest buildings
so
in Columbus."
I'm on the edge of this. There's a lot of things. We'll go into the Gen Z here in a second, but there's a lot of things about both that I'm like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's mine because I'm right there on in between. But I remember where I was 9/11. I was in first grade, but I can. Isn't that crazy?
That alone would put you,
makes
though,
me
I think,
feel
in
so
as a
much older.
millennial.
Yeah,
Because
But-
you remember.
but I remember it vividly. I
Yeah.
remember my mom and my grandma picked me up from work. They brought us McDonald's, and I went home. It's like, this is weird, because that was back in the day when the schools used to call the teacher, and any time the phone rang, you hoped that somebody was there to get you. Anyway, so it was my mom, and they took me home. My dad was in Las Vegas and for a work trip, and they ended up renting a car and driving
home?
24 hours
Wow.
home that night. And that was before
Wow.
cell phones.
Yeah,
I actually just
it
remember the whole
is.
thing.
It was.
Before like ubiquitous cell phones. Anyway, I can remember that. My first cell phone, I was in the 6th grade, I believe, and it was the click to text, no Wi-Fi, no nothing like that. But interesting.
That's
How
funny.
has it affected the way you view church, the way you view ministry, the way you view the world?
Wow. So hard to tell with church because I gave my life to Jesus in middle school. My youth pastor, one of the things I think is interesting about church is that as churches evolved, what used to only be acceptable for youth groups is now the norm for church in general.
Yeah.
It used to be
Yeah.
if you were going to be creative, innovative, futuristic, then you had to build your own kingdom within the church.
Yeah.
And the senior pastor usually didn't care, said all those cute little creative technological people. But now it's so I was fortunate from the moment I gave my life to Jesus, my youth pastor was very futuristic. He was always whatever leader that was directly over me was always kind of pushing the boundaries. But so the way that looked for me is in church in middle school was the church I was a part of was very traditional. The youth group was very cutting edge. Growing up, it's funny because until you pull yourself out of it, you don't even know how that affected you. But I definitely grew up with, and I never knew how much. I mean, part of this I think is an innate personality thing, and then part of it may be as a millennial, but I always grew up with an insatiable desire to change the world. And that whatever I wanted to do had to be connected to meaning
Yep.
and had to be connected to a huge contribution to the earth.
Yeah.
I think I think people in the millennial generation are inspired by that very thing. Like there is a search for meaning and purpose. Whereas I think they grew up or they had parents that the main focus, when we're talking about baby boomers, was about money. It was about comfort. It was like, I watched my parents or grandparents, they had nothing. And it's like, we're going to live
And
well.
more about their neighborhood.
Huh?
More about their neighborhood as opposed to
and so I think
society as a
millennial,
whole.
you got to remember, what are some of the significant organizational and entrepreneur-like movements that happened from millennial generation? Toms.
Yeah, millennials are very
Right?
entrepreneurial.
But I mean,
Like McCoskey, all
you
those
just think
guys.
about all the people that it feels like now
It's cause-driven
it's
business,
cause-driven. It is. And so now it's funny. If you ever watch like Shark Tank, I love watching that show. And you see these people come on there, and you almost never have anybody come on there without a business idea that is also going to, hey, this is also going to clean up our beaches, and this is also going to do this. And so now I almost feel like, I got to be honest with you, it almost gets to the point where it feels a little inauthentic.
Yeah.
Now, every business has some kind of thing they're attached to, and it's like, are you
buy
doing
our
that? So you-
cheeseburger? We're going to give
you-
0.5%
Yeah,
to
it's-
help dolphins. And,
And-
not to chip into the commentary, but I did write this down because I thought this was interesting. I was talking about like what you tell people at work. Baby busters want to see, or baby boomers, where there's a lack of authenticity. Millennials, they said, are confident and tech savvy, but I think that also depends on which part of the spectrum you're on, because I have millennials that are, I have millennial friends that are 7 years younger that make fun of me for how not tech savvy they say I am, but that their thing is give me some confidence and opportunity.
Yes.
Like their thing, whereas an older generation was give me an office. I think a lot of millennials, everybody's different. I mean, it's cool, like, to have an office, but I think most millennials are like, no, just give me an opportunity. I can make an office out of Starbucks.
Right.
But just give me something fun to do that is actually in my wheelhouse and that I also feel like is meaningful. And that's all I want.
I think the world has become smaller for millennials too.
Yeah.
And so I think you see the de-regionalization of America with the millennial generation and even church. Like, I think that as the millennial workforce has come of age and as they've assumed some leadership positions, as
Right.
they've led some organizations, started some companies, you see that it's not like you can do anything anywhere.
Yeah.
And I
Right.
think they're aware of the interconnectedness
Yeah.
of the world.
Yeah.
Like
I think
instead of,
the world has become smaller, but I also think that their community has gotten larger. So
Yeah.
whereas now I think, and that spills over, I think the Gen Z is that community generations before existed in your actual neighborhood, proximity neighborhood. Then I think it's just widened some, and now I think with millennials and then Gen Z that it's just my best friend could be living in South Africa.
Well, and
I mean, it's just
Well, you, think
you know what I mean.
you don't have to have a quarter to use a phone.
You don't have to. You don't have to
You
pay
know,
the long
you-
distance. You're
you
on
don't have to-
FaceTime, Wi-Fi all the time. You can talk.
You can text
it's-
message.
So
You
I just
can-
think the world has gotten smaller, but our communities have gotten larger.
Well,
What
not to
community
skip
I'm-
ahead, but I think one of the future conversations, this will continue to be for the church, is, the old model, and I'm not saying this should ever not be the model, is whatever community God places a church in, that's the old word is parish. That's your parish.
Yeah.
That's your community that you pastor. We believe in
Yeah.
that. We so into this community.
Yeah.
We believe God's put us, if you're watching, the context we're in. We're in Canal, Winchester, Central Ohio. We believe God's put us in here, not just for Canal, Winchester, City of Columbus, Lancaster, all these areas that God has called us here to love and serve this community. But, we've talked about it. They talk about it in one of the podcasts we've been listening to about already, about the interconnectedness really creates communities where you may feel closer and more kindred in spirit
Yeah.
to that there may be a digital community of some people that are in Seattle or LA that because of where you live in an urban, suburban, rural context, or even what your interests are, what your preferences are, what your style of church is, there may be more of a kindred of spirit of that context than what your local geographical context is. And so I think one of the fascinating conversations for the future is, what does that look like for churches, pastors to lead, serve, and pastor the local geographical context, but also the digital context
Yeah.
that you may feel actually even more kindred in spirit to somebody that's
Yeah.
across the planet.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get through this. Last generation we'll go over. I think there's one more that exists, but we don't know enough about them yet. But Generation Z, these people were born after 1997. They say that this is going to be the next great generation. Sorry, that since the early 1700s, the most common last name has changed in this generation from Smith, but not anymore. Now it's Rodriguez.
Wow.
Which is
Diverse.
interesting. Yeah, the diversity of a generation. 61% of children in this generation, 8 to 17, grew up with televisions in their rooms. 4 million will have their own cell phones. They have never known a world without computers or cell phones. Now, this was interesting. They have eco-fatigue. They're actually tired of hearing about the environment and the many ways to save it.
Wow, that's fascinating.
That might be
The
a word.
millennials were on the push to save it, and the next generation goes,
Like,
I'm
shut
tired
up.
of it.
They're like, I don't know if it's worth saving.
Yeah.
We'll
That's
just go to
interesting.
Mars.
Yeah.
With the advent of computers and web-based learning, children leave behind toys at a younger age. They're growing older at a younger age,
Oh, yeah.
and many companies have suffered because of it. Companies like Mattel, the makers
Yeah.
of Barbie dolls, things like that.
Well, they have these toys in their hands
I
now.
know.
Everything is I play a game. Like your kids have grown up with iPads in their hands.
They are savvy consumers, and they know what they want and how to get it. And they are oversaturated with brands, which I think is
That's
interesting.
They're called what? This will be called the screenagers, the digital
Screenagers.
natives.
Yeah.
I'll go
my
first on
kids.
this because I would say that I'm closest to this generation. How do I keep saying that? Generation. Yeah, I think the screen thing has a lot to do with it. And even piggybacking off of our last, that conversation about a small world, I think that, when you grew up with one of these,
Yeah.
anything's possible.
what?
With a cell phone, geography is just... geography means really nothing.
Yeah.
Is that I can live a New York City lifestyle wherever I'm at,
Right.
because my echo chamber can be one
Right.
that's traditionally considered a New York City echo chamber. And so I think we have yet to see the full effect of what these screens have produced. I actually think there's this one pastor who makes this pretty bold prediction. Pastor is the largest church in America. He says he thinks that the Gen Zers will actually turn on social media, and they'll turn on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and they'll want to live a life more
I've been
free
saying
of
that
it.
too.
Yeah.
I think they're going to revolt against it.
I've been
Yeah.
saying that since I was 7.
I've
Yeah,
been
I
saying
actually,
it since
I
before
actually
was born.
started saying that
Yeah.
before it ever even
Hey,
existed.
the good news is if
My mom says my
the good
first
news
word.
is if I said it before both of you. Because
By
I'm
default.
older than you guys.
Yeah.
I do. I think that I wonder about that. It's funny because I see with my kids a love-hate relationship with it. It's like it's an appendage. It's like I have to, but then I see like and I will go so far as to say, with the speed of technology and the advancements in the last several years, I also think that there's a gap within that. Whereas my oldest daughter, who was born in 2001, she was born, she was born in 2000. I kept thinking of 9/11. She was born in September of 2000. Just a year before that, she didn't have a cell phone until I can't remember what age. It was probably 10, somewhere in there, 11 or something like that. Whereas my younger daughter, she did have one at a younger age. Like so like my oldest daughter does remember the time when we actually used to have a phone in our house that had a cord.
Yep. Yep.
My youngest daughter does not.
first house I
and they're
lived
all in the
until
same.
7th
And they're
grade
all
had that.
they're all in the same generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my oldest daughter, grew up watching cartoons on TV, even if it was cable. Right, I didn't, but
Saturday
they did.
morning cartoons.
Well, it's Saturday morning, but she grew up. It was more of
No,
like
but
on
it
demand,
wasn't
but
Saturday morning,
like
though,
Dora
because
and
you
like all
have-
these other things. And
When you grew up, you probably didn't have the Nickelodeons of the world.
right?
Bro, I did.
But when you were
I didn't.
young,
I didn't.
Yes.
I feel like it came
At
around more when I was
fifth
a kid.
grade.
That's why you guys are
Nickelodeon,
spoiled
Snick, Are You
entitled
Afraid of the
brats.
Dark? Every Saturday.
Yeah,
That's why you guys are spoiled
You
in
guys
title.
are
But
so old.
but what's interesting is like Audrey, so my youngest daughter, and they're only 5 years apart. She did not grow up watching TV. She grew up watching YouTube.
Yeah.
They're 5 years apart. They're all in the same generation. Lauren grew up watching High School Musical and just shows that were on cable networks. Audrey did not. And so we would find ourselves, even as she got older, it's like, hey, we're going to watch something Lauren would, and she would not be interested. I can't think of TV shows she used to watch. She didn't watch TV.
Actually, second grade, that's when I started watching Nickelodeon.
I have a couple things I want to bring up about this generation. I'll move on and get the big picture from you guys to see how this is going to affect us moving forward. But two things that when I think about Gen Z, they have to deal with high anxiety at an earlier age. And maybe it's in a medical context, I don't know, mental health context, but I think it's just pertaining to the amount of information that their phone in the 8th grade will ding at every school shooting that ever happens. Yeah. Then they can see the video of that in 1 second. And there's no filtering of information, that they get it from every side and they get it from all of the outlets that I think this generation, my little brother is definitely Gen Z, and he has a numbness to a lot of information. So as where my parents, I think, are hyper aware of everything that's going on and engage in news a lot, my little brother is like, I'll start to care when I personally feel the effects of what's going on, not just when I see a tweet and not just when I see they have a numbness about them that I think will be interesting to see play out in the future.
Yeah. It is crazy when you think about how they get information when it was even millennial and other generation. I think most of your information was filtered through your parents growing up. Now they have direct access to people they follow and other things they're watching. So they're now being informed. Not your parents.
How about this?
Parents don't know.
How about this?
They're being informed.
That's where I was going to go next. Is that I think the second half, the more recent Gen Zers, are the first generation to have parents that understand technology and how to parent with it.
Yeah.
Because I think the first half of Gen Zers grew up with parents who are completely
They were the baby
illiterate.
boomers that didn't know anything about
and
it.
how to filter what's possible, what it means to have the internet on your phone full time.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of damage that we'll see the results of that in the future. But I don't know. I think that there's a lot of interesting things happening.
Yeah.
Generations are changing so quick. The one that's coming up, my kids, Generation Alpha, I already see. I'm like, oh my gosh, their childhood is so much different than mine. My son knows how to work my phone probably better than I do. But we are very intentional about the way we parent him on devices. They make a device, Amazon, the Fire, specifically for kids. And so you can download all these things, but you have no ability to go outside of the realm of certain games that are already filtered. That didn't exist when I was a kid. My kids, instead of watching YouTube, they have Disney Plus and YouTube, and Paramount Plus is the new one with all the Nickelodeon subscription-based smart TVs. Like literally the TV is on there. They won't know what DirecTV is. They won't know what
satellite won't even
They won't know what that
thing.
is. They watch shows on their phones.
Yep.
There's so much that's different about the way they grew up. But
I think COVID's going to be the single event that is going to define that change to a new generation. I think that's going to kickstart this new
generation.
It will be interesting. But let's talk about just what effect all of this and everything that we've talked about, all of these intricacies, all of these overgeneralizations that we've been doing, how does it affect us in church? And how does it affect you in leadership? How do you build an environment that's compassionate, cohesiveness, and we get the best of all of these different categories?
It's a great question. I feel the tension of this a lot. I think the older I'm getting and the longer I've been in ministry, I feel it even more. I always wanted to have a church where I want to surround myself with younger people. Even though I was young when I started this church, and in many ways would maybe for the amount of years I've been in ministry probably still be considered young in that regard a little bit. But I always wanted to surround myself. So where I'm feeling the tension now, because you're 25, 26, and again, that's one of the things I do like about our dynamic is sitting around the table. We have about a
26,
gap.
36, 56.
Yeah, exactly. I look really good for 56, don't I? I appreciate that. But one of the things that I'm feeling, and it's the length of time in ministry, and what I've been a part of is that we have, so our guy who does social media, Tucker, is how old? 21 or 22?
22.
Two.
Two.
I think he might have turned 22.
He'd
Just
probably be in
recently.
Gen Z for sure, though.
Yeah. What's interesting is that I have to wrestle with stuff that is created that I go, I don't really like that. But then happen to have a conversation and go, yeah, but that's what's really current. And okay, what do I want as a
Relevant,
pastor to lead, to represent our church that I will like, but if I hold on to everything that I like, then the church is going to age with me, and it's going to become irrelevant to people his age. So I have to be cognizant of that, and I have to surround myself with younger people. And we also have on our staff, I think we have a very diverse age-wise demographic. Yeah. We have 60-year-old.
Yeah.
We have 50-year-old.
Yeah.
40, 30, 20s. I don't know if we have any teens on staff. But I mean, so we're spanning quite a few generations. And I think it works in multiple ways. And I think what's challenging about that in church life is that you can have people that a lot of times that are older. And so if they have older and they got more time and maybe based on all that stuff could be leading areas, the ministry and department, but yet having support staff that are creating and coming up with ideas, because that's what they're doing, that spans 20 years or 30 years. And so having to kind of like, how are we going to appeal to people, and what's that going to because I don't ever like, someone asked me once, well, what's your demographic? What age are you trying to hit? And it's like, okay, I understand that, but I don't want a box, because I want to reach people that are far from God. I don't care if you're 68 years old or if you're 8 years old, right? I do understand that some churches, based on probably the leadership and the age of the average, of the leadership, and that are probably going to appeal more in preference and style. And so for me, the tension that I've kind of, I think in the last couple of years, and I think as we, as social media has become one of the primary drivers of communication in the church today, is and what we have running that is like, I'm at a point where it's like I'm having to kind of go, I don't really like that, but if you all really think if you guys all think red sweatpants are going to be the thing, that's fine. We can get them.
They're awesome too.
And they're awesome, and I see like 8
sweatpants.
people wearing them, and they're all 13. And that's great, but I want to. But you know what? We need red sweatpants. Just because you have a pair doesn't mean anything. We need red sweatpants. We do. We need that. I don't have a problem with red sweatpants. That was just an example. And so I want to be able to let's have those things. Whereas I know that there's a huge portion of our church that are like, I'm never going to buy a pair of red sweatpants. I'm not saying I would. I'm just saying there's a huge portion that would not buy a pair of red sweatpants. So I just think that
if you want to buy a red sweatpants, you can download our app.
You can go to the shop.
Just search X Church, click the shop.
So I
you
just
can buy
think
some right there.
I think that the one
They're
thing that's
awesome.
been an advantage for me in at least trying to remain current as I get older is that I have worked, in most of my earlier professional career was in technology. So I am not a late adopter of technology, but I would always lean toward an early adopter of all technologies. And our church, I think that has kind of become a historical thing with our church. We were an early adopter in moving lights and haze, and people when they first started coming to our church, because in this area, I don't know many other churches were doing it. We were in 2008. 2009 and doing multimedia video while the band's doing stuff with lighting and different programming this stuff.
Back when there were crank lights.
There were crank lights, yes. And
actually
and it was just, and I remember, a lot of people were coming in and were like, this was the funniest one to us when we first did this. This speaks to the generational differences, right? When we were first doing that, and we didn't probably have the best environment for it, low ceilings and all this, but we'd have haze in the room, and it wasn't like a big room where it's not overly noticeable. And, you'd have older generation would come in and they would have to leave, and they're like coughing and they're like, I can't be in there. It affects my asthma, all the smoke. And we're like, it's not smoke. It's sugar water. Like that should not affect your asthma. You know what I mean? But I think it had so much to do with an anxiety around, this is not church. I can't tell you how much we heard that when we were early in the late 2000s to early 2010s and stuff we were doing is like, this isn't church. And so I think that we have to constantly navigate that. That's and I think we also have to now look at the younger generation and say, how are we going to make sure we engage them where they've grown up with this, so that this is more normal.
That's good.
Right? This is normal.
What about you?
Oh, so many thoughts, but I the one that sticks out the most is what you hit on, which is what you surround yourself with. Satchel Paige, he's this baseball player / comedian / philosopher. He has this question that's kind of tongue in cheek, which is, if you didn't know how old you were, how old would you be? And I love that. And what's funny is, like, if you're in the church world, there's like 5 or 6 like fathers of the faith right now that are all 60 years old, and some of them seem like they're 90, and some seem like they're 30.
Yeah.
And I think the difference is you got the ones that, and everybody, they have different contexts, different people they're reaching, and I get that. So that factors in. The geographical place you're a part of, the people you're reaching, this kind of city, that all factors in. But one of my best friends in the world I talk about is Logan, who is mature beyond his years. He's a deep well, but he's 25, 26. And I love, he makes me so angry when I'm around him. And I say that tongue in cheek because he'll keep me, and he'll pick at things that he'll sharpen my mind. And he'll keep me cutting edge on the things that I need to. And so I just think one of the great, whether it's ethnic diversity, gender diversity, one of the greatest things all of us can do is to surround ourselves with people on both ends.
Yeah.
I want to always be surrounded by the youngest, sharpest minds. Like, I always want that. And I love where David says, it talks about one generation telling the works of God to another generation. We lose out on the richness of life when we lose grasp on either end. If I don't have some older gray hairs that are telling me decades ahead of things to watch out for, pouring wisdom, telling me, hey, I know you're going super fast on this, you're busy building, but just telling you, looking back, here's what really matters.
Yeah.
To bring that perspective when I need it, because I'm a fast-paced, fast-charging. I'm gonna, and sometimes just being around an older person for a while, you can't help but walk away. That's why David almost says sometimes it's better to be a funeral than a celebration, because there's those moments, and sometimes being around older people can do that. But then I hope that I'm always surrounding myself with people that will keep me sharp, keep me relevant, keep me current. And so I think that's the huge thing.
I agree.
I think one of the big things when you're working, whether it's in a church context or any context, I think education, going back to last year when all the social unrest was here, the more you educate yourself, the more you build a bridge of empathy.
Yeah.
And when you build a bridge of empathy, then you're going to connect with whatever that generation is, and you're going to know how to complement and build the world together. So, I mean, when you look at, just real quick, when you look at Gen Z, I can't remember if it was one of the podcasts, one of the books I was reading, talk about when you look at all these different generations we've talked about, one of the things that's helpful to look at is the overall mood or atmosphere based on the defining moments that kind of shaped that generation. And there right now is a pendulum swing from confident generation to cautious generation to confident generation. And then Gen Z, they're saying, is it going to be another cautious generation? They've had 2 economic downturns. Talk about growing up worrying about school shootings, talking about social unrest. Then you talk about all the anxiety, all the overstimulation. You talk about the social laziness at times and social isolation that can come from being addicted to screens. I read somewhere that psychologists are saying the regular anxiety of someone in Gen Z is the same as a psych patient in the 1950s. Wow. That helps us know, as a church, how to reach, how to have compassion. So when I look at that generation, I look with both concern and compassion. Then I also look just the hopeful side of me with hope. Man, my secret hope is maybe this is the generation that's going to bring some of the greatest contributions to the church and the world about mental health and emotional health. Maybe this is going to be the generation that brings a balance. Like I love what you mentioned earlier. I think about part of it is parents, not any fault of their own. They probably didn't know how to manage and steward their children when it comes to technology. A great thing to YouTube later is Simon Sinek when it comes to when you look at the unfettered, unhinged access to endorphins that comes through social media and those hits and what it does to young children. So my hopeful side is maybe I just believe God's going to raise up a generation with mental and emotional awareness, and that maybe brings a balance to where, hey, let's leverage technology. We're going to have a pulse on technology. We're going to understand. People talk about the future of the church. Is it going to be digital or is it going to be authentic? And I think the wise people don't create either or dichotomies. They create both ands. And hopefully this new emerging generation is not only going to have a healthy awareness, but they're going to say, here's how I'm going to leverage technology, but here's how I'm going to take a step back from addiction and social isolation. I mean, one of the things, we didn't even, I guess, get into a ton of the practical. One of the things that I think is interesting in younger generations is those that won't even make a phone call.
Yep.
So my parents, they've learned how to text, but they don't love to text.
Yeah.
That's that end. And then on this end, you have people that, wait, call?
What would I say?
What would I say?
That's what I've heard.
And so I think that's part of where you get into the practical tensions of, because my challenger side of me, like, I get it. I text all the time. But then there's that other side, and it's like, but no, in some cases, you need to pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Because there's some things, unless it's face-to-face or at least voice-to-voice inflection, you're never going to get into the deep nuances of an actual conversation and know how they're actually feeling, how they're actually processing, and have a back-and-forth dialogue. That's a bunch of riffing, but...
I think it's a lot of good things. I think for me, I think that what will move and unite every generation together is not any one method. And
Right.
so I think if you were to look at the church or future business or the way the marketplace will work, if you were to look at it through a method, I think you're going to be wrong.
Right.
Now, you can't play to any one method. I think that there's a lot of different angles to go, but what will create effectiveness in every sphere will be the strength, the passion behind, the clarity behind a mission.
Right.
And do you have a mission? Why are we here? Why am I, going to operate through these antiquated methods? Or why am I going to learn all of these newfound technologies that are why? And why are we building this church the way we're building it? And I think that the mistake would be, and no longer can you just build, because of the oversaturation of brands or anything, no longer can you just build a brand, right, and be successful. That's not the only measure. No longer can you just be the best at a method, because as soon as you get good enough, there's somebody across the country, across the world who's doing it better than you, have created something else that's left you in the dust. I think no longer can you just cater to a region. I think regionalism is dead. Like, there's people who cannot wait, or are grown up on a farm right now as a farmhand, but have dreams and have been trying to ingrain themselves in LA culture so they can move out there and live a life out there, and they're already preparing their life for it. Those are the types of things that you can do right now with modern technology, with internet at your farmhouse. Does that make sense? I mean, there no longer can you say, well, this works here, because if it works here, chances are it will work everywhere. But do you have the strength and mission as to where you can take the 70-year-old who's working for you, that's worked for your company for 40 years, or you can take the 18-year-old who's full of that wonderful, glorious naivete, and can you merge the wisdom and the optimism into one mission that can do something important? And so, like, is the future of the church high production? Who knows? Is the future of the church traditional? That was the argument that we had in church for a long time. Is it going to go back to a more contemplative or experience, or is it going to go to more of a concert feel? Blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, it's whoever does it with the strongest mission. Yeah. And so I know churches right now that have pews that have a really strong mission.
Right.
And I know churches right now who are online only, but they have a really strong mission. And I don't think either one of them is more right.
Right.
I think that they're both doing effective work because they're unified behind a mission. And so maybe that's the question that I would ask people is, what's your mission? Your methods are going to change. And in 5 years, the method of driving a car, for example, is going to change. It's going to be electric. It's going to be self-driving. Yeah. Okay? You're never going to have to park ever again. But the method might change, but the mission is the same. I need to get from point A to point B. And so thank you guys for just this awesome conversation. And I am looking forward to your part 2 message. I think it's going to be really incredible. You can watch live.dx.church. We'd love to have you. even if you've never been a part of our church or any church before. As always, if you would like to send in your question, we love our community that's being built online. You can send it to podcast@dx.church through email. You can like, you can share, you can subscribe to everywhere you can find this podcast. We love you very much. See you next week.